Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Bill of Rights Institute's Debate Resolution Preparation webinars. We're really excited to have you all here. We are going to get started in just a second. Tonight we have with us Dr. Glaser from George Washington University, Elliott School Institute for Security and Conflict Studies. Waiting for everybody to hop in. Dr. Glaser, you can go ahead and start your video.
Okay. Good.
Awesome. We're good. Okay, so I'll give us a little introduction. Thank you all for showing up. As I said, my name is Jeffrey Horn from the Bill of Rights Institute. I'm the Director of Student Programs, and we're really excited to hold these resolution preparation webinars. Tonight, we'll be looking at the National Speech and Debate Association's policy resolution. The United States federal government should substantially increase its economic and or diplomatic engagement with the People's Republic of China. As I said, tonight's expert is Dr. Charles L. Glaser. He is a professor of political science and international affairs and the director of the George Washington University Elliott School Institute for Security and Conflict Studies. His research focuses on international relations theory and international security policy. Dr. Glaser will give us approximately a half hour of his time to address you on the issue, after which he will spend about 25 minutes having a Q&A session, answering any questions you guys have regarding this resolution. And then without further ado, Dr. Glaser.
Hello and welcome. I've never done one of these webinars before, so hopefully it will go well, and I look forward to your questions. My research tends to focuses on international security questions, not economics questions. So I'm going to spend most of my time this evening addressing the security side of things. So I'll touch on economic issues. And because we have limited time, I'm going to actually try to sketch a variety of issues that are relevant to the question of diplomacy, and particularly diplomacy in the economic realm, and leave time for questions for you to dig into some of the details more broadly. So I'm going to frame the question by saying that, or the issue of this resolution by saying there are two very basic questions that you should consider addressing. The first, which many people may overlook, is the question of whether or not the United States should retain its commitments, specifically its security commitments to East Asia. This is what's called the grand strategy question. There's not a lot of debate on it in the policy world, actually in the government. There's a fair amount of discussion these days in the academy and think tanks on this question. So I'm going to spend less time on it, but I want to sketch it out for you. The second question would be, assuming we're staying in East Asia, which is a very good assumption for the near and medium term, and probably for the long term, what are the different ways in which the United States can engage, and what are some of the arguments for and against greater or lesser engagement? So let me start then on this question of whether the United States should maintain its security commitments in East Asia. The United States, as you know, or I expect that all of you know since I've learned that debaters are very conscientious, is that the United States has long-standing alliance commitments in East Asia, most prominently with Japan and South Korea, but also importantly with the Philippines. And we also have friendships that are not complete security commitments with a number of other countries in the region. The debate, I'm going to divide it into two schools, partly just so you can get the basic shape of the argument. First, I'll say what the arguments are for leaving. And this is what the school or the set of arguments is often captured under the term neo-isolationist. Neo-isolationists argue that the United States can better achieve its security commitments by ending its security alliances in East Asia and in Europe, in Western Europe in particular, but Western and Central Europe, and simply protecting its homeland narrowly. This is as I said, it's quite contrary to current U.S. policy. But this would entail, in East Asia, would entail breaking our alliance commitments and bringing home the forces that we forward deploy in quite substantial numbers in South Korea and Japan. So what would the argument be for breaking this security commitment? I just mentioned 3 points. First, the argument is that the United States can be highly secure and is highly secure with respect to China without these forward commitments because it's far away. And specifically, the great distance between the United States and China, and in particular, the fact that it's water, which makes it even harder for the United States to be attacked, means the United States is very highly secure without these allies. Second, the United States is even more secure because it has a highly effective nuclear deterrent, which China has no prospects for undermining. And therefore, the United States, in a sense, has these two very powerful deterrent and denial capabilities that increase its security. Third, proponents of neo-isolationism argue that the United States can stay out of any war that happens in East Asia. If there were a substantial war between China and Japan or between North Korea and South Korea that drew in China, the United States could stay out of the war. And therefore, we don't need to be forward deployed and forward committed to avoid getting involved in those large conflicts. And on the flip side, they argue by staying in the region, we may well get drawn into conflicts or be directly involved in conflicts that we will not be able to avoid. So overall, the argument is that we're fine without these alliances. Now, just to remind you, why am I bringing this up? If the question is, should the United States engage more or less diplomatically with China? Now, obviously, if we broke our commitments to East Asia, it would greatly reduce the number of possible topics or issues on which we could engage. And so this is really a foundational question. It's often taken for granted. But if you wanted to argue that we should be less engaged with China, one very strong way to get at this might be to, or would be to look at our grand strategy commitment. Neo-isolationists, however, do not argue that the United States should end its economic involvement. And in fact, a large part of their argument is that we can maintain the very high levels of economic engagement we have now, maintain the open economic system without having the alliance commitments in the region. Okay, so what are the counter-arguments? And I keep going quickly because I want to get to the second question. But what are the counter-arguments? The first argument is that the United States could easily get drawn into a war between the United States, between China and Japan, or between China and South Korea. History suggests that this is a danger. The United States got drawn into the First and Second World Wars when it was not committed and did not have alliance commitments in Europe, and the United States joined the Korean War, when it did not have a commitment on the Korean Peninsula. So simply not having commitments, at least historically, has not been a good way or a good indicator of staying out of commitments. The second main commitment is the United States has, among its major security interests, is that it's interested in nonproliferation. And our alliance commitments in general and specifically in East Asia are understood as supporting our nonproliferation policy. Specifically, Japan and South Korea would very likely get nuclear weapons. It's very easy for them technically to do so, would likely get nuclear weapons if the United States broke its alliance commitments to these countries, and it obviously would then break its nuclear commitment to protect them against nuclear attack or losing a conventional war. So we have a kind of broader security interest in proliferation and being there. The third argument is that our economic well-being, as well as the well-being of our allies, depends upon our security commitments. And specifically that if the United States were to pull out of the region, you'd start to see greater military competition, which I think is very, very likely. This military competition would eventually tend to undermine the open economic order and would hurt the United States economically as free trade decayed. I'm not going to try to adjudicate the debate. I would be glad to go into it in greater detail. Both of the schools I've identified have presented much more nuanced positions. There are some divides even within these schools that I'm not touching on, and there are actually a couple other schools. But the point here is that if we stay in the region and maintain our current policy, which I tend to be in favor of, although I respect the other arguments, then we have to ask the second question, which is how should we be engaged? Okay, so then I'm going to move to that second question, which is maybe more in the sphere of the resolution, although I don't know how you're going to take it on as a debate question. Let me touch briefly on economic engagement, because I'm not going to talk about it at length, but should raise it. First of all, it's important to keep in mind that the United States is very, very extensively engaged with China already economically. As you know, the two countries are highly engaged, are highly interdependent. There's large trade in both directions. The U.S. has a trade deficit with China, but there's large amounts of trade in both directions. In addition, China is a member of the World Trade Organization, as is the United States, so that on a variety of issues that are covered by the WTO, which actually covers a very wide range of free trade issues, the United States and China are already have agreement and are engaged through the cooperative mechanisms and consultative mechanisms of the WTO. In the economic realm, what are the ways there could be further engagement? What are the current topics? Okay, many of you, if you haven't heard about it in the U.S.-China context, have heard about it in the context of the ongoing presidential debate. There's a debate over TPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. China is not a member of this accord, which still is not a ratified treaty. As you know, at this point, both candidates are skeptical of the treaty, although Hillary Clinton was a supporter of the agreement. China is not a party to the negotiations or the agreement. Some people believe this was a good idea. It's a way for the United States to gain an economic advantage in the region. It's a way to reduce China's economic influence in the region. It's a way to compete economically with China. Other people think the United States should have tried harder to include China earlier, thinking it would be a way to bring China into yet more fully into the economic order, avoid having it feel excluded, and avoid this dimension of competition. And then there's a third position, which is it would be good to have China in, but it's so far from being able to meet the current requirements of the agreement that it would have simply slowed down negotiations. So if you're, anyway, in short, if you're in favor of increasing economic engagement, one obvious and current debate and current issue is over TPP. A second issue, which you may not have heard of unless you're following economic issues, is what's called the AIIB, which is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. This is a Chinese initiative designed to, like it sounds, increase investment in infrastructure and basic economic capabilities in Asia. Interestingly, the United States was opposed to this Chinese initiative, arguing that in a variety of ways the World Bank could do a better job on these issues. The United States discouraged its allies from joining, but nevertheless, many U.S. allies, including Great Britain, have joined as founding members of the IIB, which started functioning, I think, at the end of 2015. So there are issues about what the U.S. policy will be about this. Many China experts in the United States think it was a mistake for the United States to oppose it, but in any event, that's on the economic front. Okay, so let me turn to the diplomatic negotiations. And here, once again, I'm going to lean toward security issues, but security and foreign policy issues obviously overlap. So what are the type of ways that the United States could be more engaged with China? So what would a list be? First, we're engaged in the region, somewhat diplomatically, although at a distance right now with China, on a variety of territorial disputes that you're probably familiar with in the East China and South China Seas. And I'll start with that issue. So the United States has position on these disputes, on whether it's the Spratly Islands, on the Paracel Islands in the South China Sea, whether it's the Senkaku Daya dispute in the East China Sea, is that it's neutral about the outcome of the territorial dispute. It, however, opposes changes in the status quo through the use of military force or coercion. However, the United States, even though it's taken this neutral position, is actually quite involved in these disputes because the disputes are between China and certain regional allies. or certain regional neighbors who are allies of the United States. So in the East China Sea, the U.S. Alliance with Japan has it rather directly involved in the Senkaku Diaoyu dispute. In the South China Sea, U.S. alliance, the alliance with the Philippines, and its not military alliance, but its growing friendship and interest in Vietnam, have the United States on the opposite side or working with countries with whom China has these disputes. So the question is, what kind of diplomatic role can the United States play if it wanted to increase its role? This is hard because China, it is hard if you wanted to increase the U.S. diplomatic role, because China's position is that the United States has no role in helping the resolution of these issues. That China wants to negotiate on a bilateral basis between itself and the disputant. It does not want to take these disputes into a multilateral forum, like, for example, ASEAN, or for a group of countries who have specifically overlapping disputes. Many of those disputes in the South China Sea are not only between China and one other country, but are between China and a number of Southeast Asian countries that themselves have overlapping disagreements in the South China Sea. China doesn't want to pursue those disputes in a multilateral forum. So the United States has little means, therefore, to increase its engagement with China. One thing about diplomacy is diplomacy takes a partner. If the United States is going to increase its diplomatic engagement with China, China has to be willing, and vice versa. If China wants to increase its engagement with us, we have to be willing. On these island disputes, which right now are the key flashpoint, I don't think they're the most important point of dispute, but they are the key flashpoint, the key month-to-month or even day-to-day points of contention. China does not see a diplomatic role for the United States. We've stated that we're willing to help, but there's not, between China and the partners, they're actually in a group, a multilateral group, that's not an option. The United States may end up playing a military role, which it does not want to play, but it is now committed, particularly to Japan. It's explained as Senkakus, which is the Japanese name for the islands, specifically fall under the U.S.-Japan security treaty. So if those islands were attacked, and if Japan couldn't protect them on its own, and China called on the United States to help defend its interest in the Senkakus, the United States would have a very hard decision to make, but it is now part of its treaty commitment. Okay, a second issue, which I've actually written on, and is still more contentious and would identify a much larger role for the United States, is Taiwan. And some of you I know just from emails that I got even before I offered to participate in this webinar, which I'm very pleased to do, had contacted me about the Taiwan issue. So I've argued that the United States should pursue a very ambitious set of negotiations with China over Taiwan and over the South China Sea and East China Sea disputes, and specifically should pursue a grand bargain. Before I go into the details, I want to make clear that the grand bargain does not have wide support in the United States, and so even if China wanted to pursue this negotiation, it's, let's say, far from clear, more accurate to say maybe unlikely, that the United States would pursue it. Right now, China is pursuing a variety of policies that make it unlikely that China would want to pursue this deal, although I think it's very much in its interest, and actually much more in China's interest than in the U.S. interest. But let me just lay out the basic logic of the deal and why people might be in favor, why I'm in favor, and why others disagree. I'm going to take I think I've got about 6 or 7 minutes, so I'm going to take further, and then I'd be glad to take questions on this, but I want to save a few minutes at the end to talk about other possible areas of diplomatic engagement. So the basic idea of the grand bargain would be that if China would resolve its disputes in the East China and South China Seas with the relevant disputants, the United States would then break its commitment to defend Taiwan. The United States has a long-standing, although somewhat ambiguous and somewhat complicated commitment to Taiwan. It's evolved over time because the U.S. relationship with China and Taiwan has changed, and when the U.S. officially recognized China, it significantly changed its commitment to Taiwan. But nevertheless, the United States, loosely speaking, has the commitment to protect Taiwan if China uses force against Taiwan for reasons that are not provoked by Taiwan. Specifically, if you might say to yourself, if you're not following this issue, how might Taiwan provoke an attack? And the argument there, or the concern there, is if Taiwan declares independence, although it actually has day-to-day independence, but if it actually declared its own independence, or even moved too close to declaring independence, that China might use force to prevent it. From the U.S. perspective, that would be a provocation, and would not, the United States, at least under certain understandings of its commitment, would not be committed to come to Taiwan's defense. One of the dangers in the relationship is there's some substantial ambiguity or grayness about what would be provocation. In any event, the argument with respect to the islands is twofold. One, or why it's important. First, it would eliminate a variety of other flashpoints, and therefore, just like eliminating the Taiwan danger, which I'll talk about in a minute, eliminating these disputes would eliminate those dangers. But if the maybe more important issue, and the thing I have focused on in my article, is that China's willingness to make concessions on the disputes would show that its aims in the region are not unlimited. And for reasons I'll get to in a moment, that's very important. So what are the benefits from the U.S. perspective of cutting its or ending its commitment to Taiwan? First of all, it is the most important territorial disagreement between the United States and China. Taiwan is a large economy, 16th GDP in the world, 23 million people. If you compare that with the Spratlys and the Paracels, which are essentially uninhabited, have very little value, have almost no strategic value, Taiwan is orders and orders of more important, at least in material terms. It turns out it's very important to China. It has a long historical commitment since the end of the Chinese Civil War to unifying with Taiwan. It's staked a lot of its current nationalist, the regime has staked much of its current nationalist credentials on eventually achieving that goal. In addition, the U.S. commitment to Taiwan raises serious doubts in China about the U.S. trustworthiness. It's often seen as one of the key reasons that China does not trust the United States, is that China is on the, quote, from China's perspective, the United States is on the wrong side of this dispute. And finally, an issue I think that is maybe underappreciated is much of the military competition between the United States and China is indirectly, if not directly, over Taiwan. Because if a large conflict happens over Taiwan, the United States is currently in a situation where it can cut off the flow of oil and other resources to China. There's no easy way to solve this military conflict in what are called in the sea lanes of communications, which are called the SLOCs. For a variety of reasons, eliminating the Taiwan problem would reduce the military concerns that are generated by U.S. Naval advantages over the sea lanes. So to sum it up, I mean, there are three major reasons. One is Taiwan is a flashpoint. Two, it exacerbates China's view of the United States, seeing us as more negative and threatening than we are. And three, it fuels or supports military competition between the United States and China, which is dangerous. So what are the arguments against? The key argument against this deal is that it's dangerous to encourage an expansionist power, especially a rising power, about the declining power's resolve. In other words, China's a rising power, the United States is a declining power. If the United States makes concessions, it may look weak. Making a concession to a very expansionist state, or what I call a greedy state, is dangerous because that state will then ask for more. So if you believe that China is quite expansionist, that it wants to control all of the South China Sea, that it wants to win the territorial disputes in the East China and South China Seas, that it possibly wants to push the United States out of the region, force the United States to break its alliance commitments with Japan and South Korea, then it's a very bad idea to make concessions on Taiwan because we run the risk of encouraging China. On the other hand, if China has limited aims or is just interested in security, then our concessions can reassure China, making China more secure, making it more satisfied with the status quo, and could actually end the dispute for some of the reasons that I've mentioned. Other reasons against this, briefly, many commentators, and I think maybe the most common criticism is if we make concessions to China, it will undermine our allies' confidence in our willingness to keep up the alliances. So specifically, major concessions to China will undermine Japan's confidence and South Korea's confidence in the U.S. alliances with those countries. Weakening those alliances undermines U.S. security goals in the region if you believe that the United States needs to maintain those commitments under the type of grand strategy we currently have. So somebody would argue we need to maintain our commitment to Taiwan, not because it's important on its own terms, but because we want to protect the U.S.-Japan alliance or the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And then finally, some people argue that Taiwan is strategically important. If you look at the map, it would enable, if China militarized Taiwan, to push its forces further to the east. It would actually eliminate a choke point that the United States now maintains that makes it hard for China to get out to sea, and so on and so forth. So there's a military reason. Each of these issues then becomes very important to look at more carefully. I'm going to stop there and leave questions for question and answer. I think it's a very, very important issue, but like I say, I'm a bit of an outlier in this, so I don't want to mislead you at all about the nature of the debate, but I think analytically the case is at least clean and clear. Very, very busy. What are other areas where there might be more diplomatic engagement? First of all, with China over North Korea. The United States and China were involved in the six-party talks to try and stop and then that can reduce further proliferation by North Korea. Those talks have basically come to a standstill largely because the United States does not want to continue engaging with North Korea given it's not willing to meet some very basic terms that the United States wants. So that's a possibility, but right now it's not going very, very, very far. The United States is actively engaged now in what are called military talks with China, which means, just like it sounds, between very high-level talks between our military and the Chinese military. These have been ongoing over the years, but also interrupted at various times when U.S.-China relations were strained. The idea here is very important, is to avoid the kind of dangers that can result from undesirable misunderstandings when forces are in close contact, when forces do certain things that might be misunderstood. So to avoid a lot of the risks that can come from operating in close quarters, which increasingly the United States and China are. And then finally, there's the room for the United States and China to engage specifically on the question of strategic nuclear forces. The Obama administration has tried very hard to get this strategic nuclear dialogue going. It's made explicit its desire. It has requested these talks with China, and for a variety of reasons I can go into, China has not taken up the United States on this issue. So this is a case where we could do more. The United States wants to do more. It does not at this point have a willing partner with China, and so there's not much progress there. But I think it's a very valuable place to look further. And I really am out of time, but I'm going to take one more minute and say there is one other area of engagement in which the United States and China are engaged. It's not diplomatic engagement. It's, at this point, military competition. Given the state of the relationship and China's improving military capability, which is natural given its starting point and that it's a rising power, the United States and China are increasingly engaged in military competition. Some people think this is good. Some people think it's dangerous. In a different world, we might be looking at possibilities for arms control between the United States and China. Right now, those are not going very far, and they're not many promising areas, but there are some areas in which that might be the possibilities for engagement down the road. So let me stop there. I think I've talked just about the right amount of time. I'm going to take a quick look at the questions I've gotten. I've only gotten There are a few, so let me look at these, and then I'll pick a couple and give you time to address more, so I'll be right back. Okay, so there are a couple questions here about trust. And so let me mention what some of the issues are about China's lack of trust in the United States. And there's always a question, I think I'm going to first say what they are. It's always quite complicated to sort out whether this trust is warranted. But let's keep the following things in mind. First, one thing many of you probably know is that there is, China over the last many decades has developed a narrative of that it was disrespected by the Western powers over a century. Partly this is a history of, it does not primarily involve the United States, but of colonial powers in China preceding World War II. But also U.S., but so anyways, there's that whole long history, which I don't have time to review, but many of you probably know. There's also the Cold War history, in which I wouldn't say that China doesn't so much identify this as disrespect by the United States, but we need to remember that the Cold War order and in the last couple of decades, the post-Cold War order are largely built by the United States. The United States is the only power around the globe during the Cold War, and even more since the end of the Cold War, that deploys forces around the globe, quite large forces in East Asia, and has major military advantages that China does not have. So in addition to this, to the century of humiliation, you have really the United States as, if not the global hegemon throughout the Cold War, certainly the global hegemon in East Asia, and even more so. Third, there is the question of Taiwan, which I think is a major sticking point. I shouldn't say sticking point. It's a major point of disagreement, and it's central both to China's historical narrative, central to its nationalist narrative, and the United States is on the wrong side of this dispute from China's perspective. We not only have the commitment to come to China's defense that I mentioned, but we also sell arms to Taiwan, arms that are identified as necessary for Taiwan to defend itself. But keep in mind that from China's perspective, Taiwan's ability to defend itself is threatening because China wants to be able to use force if necessary to prevent Taiwan from declaring independence. So what we see as defensive and Taiwan sees as defensive is understandably, not necessarily justifiably, but understandably from China's perspective, threatening. And then finally, keep in mind that closely related to our large power projection capabilities deployed in East Asia, the United States has alliances in what China will reasonably consider its backyard. We have alliances with its near neighbors on its periphery with Japan and South Korea, and in somewhat different degree with the Philippines. Imagine if China had alliances with, say, Canada and Mexico, and had large bases within 100 or 200 kilometers of the U.S. border. And that even if we didn't have military disputes, or I should say political disputes with China, whether the United States would feel comfortable simply with those military deployments. But in a world where you do have disputes, it's quite natural just by the nature of major power politics for states to not trust each other, or I would say worry about the other state's motives and intentions. And so instead of seeing the United States as a benign, unthreatening power that only wants to protect itself, China sees the United States as a power that wants to influence far beyond its borders, and sometimes in ways that are contrary, quite significantly contrary to China's interests. So I would say it's understandable that China has this lack of trust, or I would say fear. In international relations theory, for some of you that have studied this, I mean, there are a number of different schools of thought. One very important school of thought is that other states can become less secure when they face a powerful state, even when that powerful state does not want to threaten them. And under the label of what's called the security dilemma, what a state does to protect itself can appear threatening to an adversary, make it fearful, make it not trust the powerful state, and lead to competition between states that don't even have political conflict of interest, but simply have fear. For those of you that are interested in this, you could look in the literature that's under the category of defensive realism. There's an alternative view, which goes under the category of offensive realism, which is basically, it doesn't matter what you do or how you act. Other states will fear you if you have military capabilities. Improving relations isn't possible between powerful states, and they're always going to compete. My good friend and former colleague at the University of Chicago, John Mearsheimer, is closely associated with this view. If you're interested in learning more about it, I have a book I recommend. It's not at all why I agreed to do this talk, but if you're interested, I have a book called Rational Theory of International Politics, or an article in International Security in 1995. Just in terms of being fair, in terms of advertising, Mearsheimer has a book called The Tragedy of International Politics that lays out the alternative view. Before him, Ken Waltz, 1979, has an argument that is often looked at as the sort of position in between the two. Okay, so I hope that addressed some of the questions on trust. Let me look for a minute at a couple of other questions, and I'll be right back to you. Okay, so there's a question here, sort of what allies are in a commitment with China? The bad news for China is that it has essentially no allies, or no militarily useful allies. It is allied with North Korea, but North Korea does not have the assets or capabilities that would be useful to China in defending itself. In fact, even though China maintains this relationship, it's much more an economic alliance, although it would or might well come to North Korea's defense. It would depend. But arguably, North Korea is more of a danger, security danger for China than a benefit. North Korea has nuclear weapons. It's gaining the capability, a missile capability right now to attack its neighbors, including Japan and South Korea. And this is actually creating problems between the United States and China because Japan is interested in defending against North Korea's missiles. The United States is now just working on an agreement with South Korea defending against North Korea's missiles through, maybe you've heard about it, it's a theater missile defense system called THAAD. China is arguing, I think quite incorrectly, but nevertheless I think believes that this THAAD system is actually directed against China and not directed against North Korea. So there's an interesting triangular relationship where a U.S. ally is responding to Japan. The U.S. helping its ally is appearing threatening to China, and it really is seriously straining that relationship. Similarly, Japan is starting to want to acquire, and in some cases is gaining capabilities that might be useful against North Korea systems. Those are starting to look threatening to China, and I think will look more threatening in the future because they could be very accurate conventional missiles. China and Russia are in a loose partnership of sorts. They do not have a military alliance. That doesn't mean that if there was a conflict that that Russia couldn't come on. See, I grew up in the Cold War, so I say often slip into saying the Soviet Union instead of Russia, showing my age here. But it's not clear that Russia would be willing to support China. Many people think that the disagreements between China and Russia are simply pragmatic, and that Russia would not be willing to take risks to protect China. And moreover, China does not have, or Russia does not have the conventional capabilities to significantly come to China's aid in the area along its periphery in the East China Sea and in the South China Sea that are most important. So if you look at it, basically China is not surrounded, but is increasingly surrounded on its periphery by U.S. allies. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, even maybe starting to become friendly, although not militarily engaged yet with Vietnam, and then moving further to the west, the United States has been over the last decade or more, improving its political relationship with India, but this also has the potential to take on military dimensions, particularly as China increases its nuclear capability, but even maybe more importantly, the reach of its Navy, which now is starting to reach or have some capability into the Indian Ocean. But I just want to say that even though we hear a great deal about the improvement in China's Navy, one thing you have to keep in mind is that the United States has literally decades of advantages and generations of military equipment advantages over China in general, but maybe especially in air and naval power. So China has a very long way to go, but it is worrying its neighbors. Okay, back to your questions. Okay, so I have a question. Do China, or rather, do Japan and South Korea have the right, and what I would add, and/or the need to protect against North Korea's missiles? And does this depend upon whether North Korea is thinking of its missiles as for offense or defense? Well, certainly in terms of rights by any international standards, but I also think just by standard needs. Sure, these countries have the right. In some ways, they would say they have the need to react. Both South Korea and Japan do fall under what's called the U.S. nuclear umbrella. So this means that if they were attacked at a minimum, it means if they were attacked by North Korea, the United States would be responsible in one way or another for responding. But allies always wonder whether a nuclear guarantor or any guarantor is actually willing to come to their protection. So both countries have some reason to worry about whether the U.S. would meet its commitment, but more importantly, they have to worry about whether North Korea would trust the U.S. to meet its commitment, whether North Korea might doubt that commitment. And so just for those reasons, doubts about whether North Korea can be deterred, whether it's a rational state, they might well want to defend themselves. Given that they have doubts and reasonably have doubts, and the United States also has doubts, then yeah, sure, it makes sense for these countries, if they could actually protect themselves, to deploy missile defenses. Missile defenses are famously hard to make work, but in the theater context, they have some capability. It's also possible to destroy missiles before they're launched, and highly accurate, a combination of very good surveillance capabilities and highly accurate conventional missiles can destroy targets. So the combination of conventional counterforce or conventional counter missile capabilities and missile defense might provide some security to countries that are threatened by North Korea's missiles and eventually its nuclear weapons. Right now, we don't think North Korea has the capability to put a nuclear weapon on one of these missiles, but particularly in range of these countries in East Asia, it will have that capability. Having said that, and even if South Korea and Japan are requiring these capabilities for their own defense, this doesn't mean that China will see it that way, and as I said, China doesn't see it that way. So this very important concept, which is the security dilemma, the idea that I can't make myself more secure without possibly challenging the forces that you need to make yourself more secure, is in operation here. It's in operation in East Asia in a variety of ways. China is deploying conventional forces in a Navy and air capabilities to try and protect its capability to stop the United States from joining a war with Taiwan. The United States sees that as a threat to its necessary conventional capabilities. Okay, I have a question. Do you think that China would ever side with the United States if we had another war? Good question. That's a bit of a stretch for most people these days. It raises the question of against whom that war would be. It's not a question that's on the table these days because we don't see a large war between the United States and another country in which China could plausibly side with the United States. And if I had to make one up, and I'm reluctant to make it up, but one can at least imagine if the United States got in a conflict with Russia in Russia's Far East, or for that matter, if Russia and Japan, as you may know, do have a territorial conflict that dates back to the end of World War II. If that conflict started and the United States got involved in that conflict, it's not impossible, but I think quite unlikely that China would join with the United States against Russia. Besides that, it's hard to see countries where that kind of alliance would take place, but it's not impossible. Okay, let me take a look at, there are a couple of longer questions here. Okay. Okay, so there's a question here, which is a good hard question about the future of the island disputes. And they ask, given that China might need to expand out of necessity due to its large population and limited space, might not the United States in a certain sense want to facilitate China's rights to these islands in the South China Sea, either through some sort of international process, through the UN, it could be through the International Court of Justice. There are a couple of factual points I should make. First of all, these islands are extremely small. We're talking about small numbers of square kilometers. So these islands are not valuable in terms of finding more space for China's population. They're teeny, teeny, teeny. Most of them are not even. Don't even have island status. And if you've heard about the island building that China is doing in the South China Sea, it's converting things that don't qualify as islands into spaces that are acres or small fractions of a square mile, a few square kilometers large. So there's no real space and population issue here. If China wants these islands, it's largely for, as I understand it, for one of three reasons. One, there may be natural resources under the sea in terms of petroleum, or in the sea in terms of fishing, that if China had sort of recognized legal control to, it would get the rights to those resources. And that's among the reasons that also some of the other claimants would like to have access. Second, China would get additional maritime control if these islands were large enough to count as islands. Then it would get control that comes with having sovereignty control. You get maritime control along the maritime periphery. And third, and most people think most importantly, China has made nationalist claims, or has identified or has created part of its nationalist narrative as including all of these islands in the South China Sea, as well as the relevant islands in the Senkaku-daiyu in the East China Sea, as well as almost all of the East China Sea as defined by what's called the 9-dash line that encompasses over 90 or close to 90% of the East China Sea. So to the extent that China wants these islands, it's for these reasons, not because of its size or expansion. Now, there's a lot of dispute about that. Most countries don't think that those reasons give China an indisputable or even strong right to the islands. The resources, the fishing and the petroleum resources can be shared. Unfortunately, the nationalist claim can't be shared. And so much of what would need to be negotiated is some sort of sharing of the right. Some people have argued that maybe all these disputes, of which are very small amounts of territory, could be put under some sort of UN protectorate, and that the resources could be shared and that none of the countries would control them. Other people talked about joint control of the very limited amount of territory that's involved. So those are the kind of creative options that people have come up with. My grand bargain would call for one of those creative options. A trial, however, at least for the foreseeable future, is unlikely to succeed. The Philippines took China to international court over certain specific claims in the South China Sea. The court recently ruled against China on all counts, much more strongly. The ruling was much stronger than many people anticipated, many countries and experts anticipated. They all went against China. China from the beginning said that it did not accept the court had legal jurisdiction over these issues, and said it would not accept the outcome, and so it's rejected the outcome. Given this experience, China is even less likely to be willing to accept international jurisdiction, at least in the near term, over any of the other cases, because it's even more likely to lose, given the precedents that were set by the recent ruling. Okay, I hope that answers that question. Let me look at, if I haven't answered any of the questions I've taken up, please send another email. I think we have a couple more minutes, and I will look. Okay, so let me answer on, there's a question here about Hong Kong and Macau. And the question is, could we make a meaningful impact toward Hong Kong? I'm just going to answer toward Hong Kong. It's the more important for a variety of reasons. As many of you probably know, Hong Kong was on lease. It was largely independent, but under Chinese ownership on a very long-term lease for 99 years. When that lease came to an end, Britain had to, by its legal standing, turned over control of Hong Kong back to China. Right now, there's a 50-year understanding before which full control of Hong Kong will go back to China. In a certain sense, it has full control, but it's under constraints and understandings that were negotiated with the British. The United States is not a major player in this. This has worked, right, so it doesn't have many levers. The largest levers on China, I think, are actually, in world opinion, how it handles the Hong Kong issue will influence other countries' willingness to cooperate with it. And most importantly, there's a very long shadow cast by Chinese policy on Hong Kong to willingness or possible willingness in Taiwan to eventually integrate on some set of negotiated terms with China. If everything looked like it was going well to the people of Taiwan and the government of Taiwan, and it looked like China was respecting long-term greater, not independence, but greater governance independence of Taiwan, that might encourage eventually that kind of negotiation with Taiwan of one country but two systems for Taiwan, where Taiwan could keep many of its, at least locally, many of its democratic institutions. In fact, what I think people of Taiwan see and much of the world sees is that things have not gone smoothly with Hong Kong, that China has been less willing to grant a degree of democratic independence to Taiwan. We saw this in the uprising, the umbrella uprising a few years ago. We see it to some extent reflected in the recent vote in Hong Kong that put some of those demonstrators into as legislators, minority legislators, but nevertheless legislators in Hong Kong. And so the real question here is how constrained is China by what the precedent that it thinks it sets for others, most importantly most importantly Taiwan, but also to some extent as an indication of how liberal China sees its future in becoming. And many countries in the region might be more comfortable if their long-term expectation was that China was going to become democratic or move toward democracy, and to the extent that they see any precedent there in Taiwan, that might be helpful or hurtful. I think if we're seeing anything right now, it's on the hurtful side. So I don't know, do I have time for a couple more questions, or is it time for Jeffrey to wrap up? Somebody there give me an indication. Do we have a few more minutes? Okay, one more question. If I don't see one pop up in a moment, I'll take one more. Okay, so here's one on the economy, which I'm not an expert on, but I will take on. Do I believe that currency manipulation is an issue with China? And if so, what might be the U.S. reasonable reactions? Okay, I think that I'm not an expert, so here I'm simply repeating what I understand on these issues. I think that there has been concern and there is ongoing concern, but I think that the expert opinion has shifted, that in earlier years and up to the last few years, that China was controlling its currency, keeping the value lower than it should be in some sort of fair market measure to help support its trade-based growth policy. However, over the last few years, China has let its currency, the renminbi, float, not in an unrestricted way, but in a less restricted way, and there's increasingly less market pressure for it to actually increase. So I think the degree of market distortion for a variety of reasons is smaller than it was, and that makes the currency manipulation a somewhat smaller worry. On the policy front, it's very, very hard, or it's very, very tricky and costly for the United States to respond, because if we start to impose sanctions or try to change or manipulate our own currency, or at least I shouldn't say manipulate necessarily, it might be called counter-manipulation, by intervening in currency markets, there are a variety of trade competitions that many people think would be unfortunate that might set into action. But my understanding is, while the issue continues to be raised among experts, I think that there's less of a problem and therefore less of for the United States to push this issue. So I think I'll stop up there. I'm going to stay online and listen to the wrap-up, and I hope all of you have found this helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for your participation. We're going to hop over here to now. So one thing we want to make sure that you all know is we would love you to take this survey that allows us to make these webinars better and fulfill your needs. So if you could please go click on that top link that says thanks for joining us, the instantly link. That would be extremely helpful. Also, we will be holding a second NSDA resolution webinar on Wednesday, October 12th. The policy topic has not been chosen yet. It will be released on October 1st. Sorry, the Lincoln Douglas topic has not been chosen yet, and it will be released on October 1st, and we will have someone here to help prep you on that one as well. We also encourage you to bring your friends, have them register, solicit them to join, let your debate teachers know. Again, we want to provide this to as many people as we can. And lastly, and the last link, you can go to check out other programs that we offer. We offer online debates, and we offer summer programs for students, and a plethora of other resources. Lastly, but not least, there is a recording of this. I will finish this recording when we're done, and within the next week it will be posted to our website under that link you see to your left. If you go there, there'll be a debate preparation tab that you can go click on and find this to watch it over again and help you guys get ready for your tournaments. If there's no other questions, thank you for your time and have a wonderful night. And thank you again, Dr. Glaser.